Okay, here we go. Lecture one. So this lecture is basically just a crash course on plant structure. So plant form, plant structure, and some of the terminology we use to describe the parts of plants. So if you took plant anatomy last semester, this lecture is going to be complete review. Um, but otherwise, right, what we're doing here is we're just kind of trying to get everyone on the same page of understanding the plant body, the parts of that make up the body of a plant. Um, what are the common threads in the body of a plant, and yeah, and just the main terms. Okay, so that's sort of where we're going, and this perspective of thinking about the plant body and sort of the body plan of plants is illustrated in this image here, showing kind of like a from left to right a sort of more just typical herbaceous plant, and then one with, these are actually pretty similar, these two on the left. But then over here, we've got sort of this transition into the weird cactus life form. And this diagram is emphasizing the commonalities between these. So you can see this is kind of like a prickly pear type of a cactus, how the leaves are taking on a different form, and the stem is starting to become more thickened, more succulent, but it's still basically the same thing. So even when we get here to like a barrel cactus, even though they look really different, they're still built on the same basic body plan. And that's kind of, I don't know, like when I learned this when I was first starting to learn about plants, and I learned this concept of the plant body plan, it was sort of like the skeleton key for me, where suddenly all these different plants that look really different from each other, once you kind of have this, it's almost like cheat code of like how to interpret what you're seeing. You see that, despite all this diversity, it's really kind of the same thing underneath. Okay, so that's sort of the idea here. So our key points are learning objectives. We're going to define and know the functional roles of the three main plant vegetative organs. And by that, I mean the roots, the stems, and the leaves. Okay. Then we will look at the plant primary tissue systems. We'll know and explain their functions, and the main cell types in plants, the three main types of cells. And then we'll look at growth in plants. So we'll describe the differences between primary and secondary growth, and which tissues of the plant, which sort of stem cell tissues or meristematic tissues, produce each of these types of growth, primary and secondary growth, or the products of those are called the primary and secondary plant body. All right. So let's start with looking at the plant body plan and these three vegetative organs. So broadly speaking, the plant body can be divided into a root system and a shoot system. Typically, in most plants, you're probably aware that the root system is underground, and its job is to absorb water, nutrients from the soil, anchor the plant into the substrate. In lots of cases, storage of starches and other types of compounds. Okay. And the shoot system is typically in most plants, not always, but typically it's the above ground part of the plant. It consists of two vegetative organs, the stems and the leaves, right? The root system is only one vegetative organ, just the roots. The root system is the roots. The shoot system comprises the stems and the leaves. Um, and as far as the jobs of these things go, well, the leaves, you probably, have a sense that their main role is in doing photosynthesis, so generating the food for the plant, the sugars, the carbohydrates that are produced by photosynthesis, right? That happens primarily in the leaves. And then the stems, their job is basically to optimally deploy leaves for photosynthesis, so spreading out, deploying leaves in the areas with the best access to light, and also deploying along the stem the reproductive parts of flowers or cones or sporangia, depending on what type of plant it is. Okay, that's not really shown here. This is just all vegetative stuff. All right. So that's kind of in summary, and that is going to be common to almost all land plants. Certainly angiosperms, flowering plants, and gymnosperms, the naked seeded plants, as well as some of the other land plant groups. They basically all have this same basic construction. So below ground root system consisting of one organ, the roots, above ground shoot system consisting of two organs, the leaves and the stems, and all kind of doing their own distinct jobs. All right. We can break this figure down a little bit more. We can look at the way that these organs, these different systems, the way they grow. We have at the tips of the roots and the shoots, we have these specialized pockets of cells called meristems, apical meristems. So a meristem, like I mentioned before, is kind of just like an undifferentiated stem cell. Okay, so it's a cell that has not taken on any sort of identity in the final body of the plant, right? So if we look at, you know, a cell in the epidermis of a leaf that has a particular identity, it does a particular thing. It's like forming the outer skin of the leaf, or inside the leaf, you could have a cell that's specialized, it's taken an identity of being a photosynthetic cell, right? In the stems, you've got cells of the epidermis also, you've got cells of the vascular tissues and so on, right? Transporting liquids, different kinds of xylem and phloem sap around in the plant. Okay, so those are all differentiated mature cells. Meristems are not like that. They are undifferentiated. They are going to later become those cells as they develop. But at this point where they are in the apical meristems of the shoot and the root, their only job is to just divide, basically. So they divide, and then some of the cell products of those divisions then differentiate and become cells of the leaf epidermis or the stem cortex or whatever it might be. Okay. So this is the principal way that plants grow. This is primary growth is from the divisions of these apical meristems. Okay. Notice we also have everywhere that a leaf joins the stem, you've got a little bud here. And inside this bud, you also have a little pocket of meristematic cells. These are called axillary buds and axillary meristems in here. So axillary means that it is sitting in the leaf axil. In other words, the leaf axil is where the leaf joins to the stem. On the upper side of that angle where the leaf meets the stem, that's called the axil, AXIL. And you have these little pockets of meristematic cells just sitting there in the leaf axil. So they're called axillary meristems or axillary buds. Most of the time, these axillary meristems are not actively dividing. They're just sort of sitting there resting. Their job is to start to divide and take over in one of two cases. So one possibility is if the apical meristem, right, the shoot apical meristem, and I forgot to mention apical meristem, apical means like apex. So like the apex of a mountain, the top of a mountain, it means it's at the very tip of the shoot or the root. Those are the apical meristems. So if there's damage to this apical meristem, these axillary meristems then will start to grow out and kind of take over the main growth of the plant, the main axis of the plant. That's one time in which the axillary buds will start to grow. Or lower down toward the base of the plant, these axillary buds will start to grow just kind of on their own. It's kind of interesting. There's a hormonal control that comes from the apical meristem that suppresses the growth of these axillary buds. So the axillary buds that are close to the apex will not grow because they're being hormonally suppressed. The farther away you get, the weaker that hormonal suppression becomes. And so then these things will start to branch and grow. And you can see they just basically grow out and form their own branches with their own stems and leaves on them, right? Okay. So this growth of plants is kind of like a fractal kind of a thing. It's like a modular. There's different modules. These side branches that grow out from the axillary buds sort of mimic the architecture of the main branch. Okay. Um, and then the roots, yeah, we'll not go in a ton into the roots, but the roots also branch kind of in their own way, lateral roots kind of absorbing water and nutrients. So that's the basic setup. The other thing to point out is that leaves, when we compare the growth of leaves versus stems and roots, leaves have what's called determinate growth. Determinate just means that they have sort of a set size and shape that they grow to, and then they stop growing. All right. Kind of like our human bodies, we have determinate growth as well. We don't keep growing indefinitely over the life of a person. Leaves are kind of the same way. They're indeterminate. So they grow, they grow, they grow, and then when they hit their sort of mature size, they stop. Right? This makes sense because leaves as photosynthetic, basically mini solar panels, they their function is pretty integrated. They have kind of an optimal size and shape to do that job of photosynthesis that kind of, is optimal for each plant species. All right. Stems and roots are indeterminate, meaning that their growth is kind of open and flexible and doesn't have sort of a set final size and shape. All right. And that makes sense functionally because stems, they need to have that flexibility, and roots, they both need to have that flexibility, right? In the case of stems, again, they're deploying leaves in an optimal way. So they need to find the best sort of sunlight that's available. And so they need to be able to say, oh, we're going to actually grow over kind of this way because there's better sun over here. We're being crowded out over on this other side, so we're going to put more energy into growing this way, and so on, right? This all kind of goes in with the the nature of a plant as like something that is fixed in the ground. It's sessile. They can't get up and like move to a better spot, so they need to be able to respond developmentally in how they grow, right? Kind of makes sense. All right, roots, same thing. The nutrients that roots are absorbing, like nitrate and stuff like that, it's often pretty patchy. And the concentrations of these different nutrients can change in the soil. So then you need to be able to kind of flexibly respond, put their effort into absorbing more nutrients in one patch of the soil than in another. All right. So this is the basic body plan. And again, right, even plants that look really different, um, you can get a lot of diversity just by changing, the distances between where the leaves attach and so on, right? So so once you kind of learn to see plants as from this perspective, it sort of unlocks a lot of sort of understanding of what's really going on. A couple of the other vocabulary terms in addition to like apical meristem, um, axillary bud. We've also got this term node. So a node is where a leaf attaches to the stem. Anywhere a leaf attaches to a stem, that's a node. And then the space between of the stem between where leaves attach, that's called an internode. Okay. Some of these other things we don't need to worry about quite so much. Okay. Yes, so I already covered all this, so I'm just going to kind of skip over this slide. This is just reiterating that point that leaves are determinate, stems are usually indeterminate, right? And that matches to their functional jobs that they have to do. Okay. So again, right here we've got a bunch of different plants. We've got a gymnosperm down here, the bristlecone pine. The rest of these are all angiosperms. So you can see all this diversity, all these different kinds of plants. Um, you look at them and think, well, I mean, they maybe all have leaves, but I can't really see like sort of what they all have in common. But you can start to see like, all right, so this plant, it's growing as a vine, but it has the basic construction. This is the shoot, with leaves attached at nodes. You've got internodes. Okay, so nothing too crazy there. This ginger plant looks kind of weird. We basically got these inflorescence shoots with these little leaves that don't really grow out because they're not doing photosynthesis. Another key to understand, and then bigger leaves in the back. Another key to understanding this is in this plant, a lot of the stem tissue is actually underground. Okay, there's nothing that says you can't have underground stems. Okay, so that gives us a very different kind of plant. We've got a little like a duckweed here, which is basically like a tiny little bit of stem and a couple of leaves and a little root hanging down. This is an aquatic plant. Okay, but still the same basic construction. It's just the stems don't really elongate or develop at all. Okay, so there is a little bit of stem, it just doesn't really grow out. We've got other weird things like this Espeletia that grows in high elevation habitats in South America, in the tropics. These plants, they're basically just trees that don't branch and just have a series of leaves, a rosette of leaves, just kind of clustered at the very top. Beneath that, we've got sort of this skirt of dead leaves that stay attached to the stem, and then this trunk. So, but not branching kind of gives it a different look from a lot of trees, but it's still basically just a kind of a tree, right? And then over here we've got a like a columnar or barrel type cactus. And in this plant, like the main difference that differentiates it from other plants that we know is that the leaves have been converted into spines, and the stem has taken over the job of photosynthesis, right? But otherwise, it still has the same basic construction of indeterminate stems bearing determinate leaves, okay, at nodes and so on. All right. Bristlecone pine, same thing, right? Just really old, really gnarled, but it's still the same basic construction. Okay. So stems, right? The job of a stem again is to sort of deploy leaves and deploy reproductive structures aerially most of the time above ground, but not always. Okay. Stems can be herbaceous, like we're seeing here in this picture in the middle. This is a green stem that doesn't really experience a lot of thickening growth. All right. Or stems can experience a lot of thickening. And that's usually what we see in woody plants like trees and shrubs, right? A significant stem thickening. Okay. But still the same basic idea. That thickening, incidentally, that's what we were, that term secondary growth is growth in thickness. Primary growth is divisions of the apical meristems resulting in lengthening of the plant. Secondary growth is thickening growth. Okay. Stems can grow underground, like the ginger on the previous slide, or like this plant. This might be an iris does this, ginger does this. Um, a number of other plants do this, where you've got above ground stem and leaf tissue, but then you've got a lot of your growth underground with stems. Okay, so a lateral underground stem is the specialized term for that is a rhizome. And really what this is kind of like a reproductive strategy because what these plants will do is they'll have these lateral rhizomes that grow underground. They'll send up a little, you know, um, and some above ground stem and leaf tissue. And then this is basically becomes its own sort of functional unit so that even if you cut this plant off from the mother plant that produced it with the rhizome, it can function independently now. And so it'll keep doing this. It'll send out another rhizome, another little cluster of leaves and stems above ground, right? And then they can become separated and still survive just fine. Note that these underground rhizomes do have roots coming off of them, like here and down here. Okay, so there's still, roots attached to stems, come off of stems at their base. Okay, you could also have an above ground stem doing basically the same thing, and we give that a different term. That's called a stolon, Stolon. Rat, sorry, strawberries do this. So wild strawberries that you can see growing in the mountains around here. You might have noticed this. So you have a little cluster of leaves and above ground stems, and then it'll send out this sort of lateral stem, very narrow, very stringy. And once it gets far enough away from the mother plant, it'll send down roots, send up some more leaves and more branched, elaborated stems. Okay, and then send out more stolons. So similarly, this is also like a vegetative reproduction strategy. Vegetative reproduction means you're not reproducing with flowers or anything like that, and you're basically just cloning yourself. So plants are really good at kind of doing that. They often do both, right? They reproduce sexually and they reproduce vegetatively, in other words, cloning themselves. Okay, so strawberries are a really good example of this plant. Spider plants that we have in the greenhouse. Maybe you've grown a spider plant and seen how they'll send out these sort of runners, right, or stolons and they maybe even will like reroot in another plant nearby or something like that. Stems can also do other weird stuff like storage. So a potato is a type of an underground storage stem. Actually, it's actually stem, not a root. Um, this is called a tuber generally based on the shape. So if it's kind of potato shape, we'll call it a tuber. And how do we know it's a stem and not a root? Well, if you look at a potato, so stems bear axillary buds and leaves, right? And if you look at a potato, you can identify where the axillary buds are. That's actually the eye of a potato. And maybe you've had the experience of leaving a potato setting out in your pantry for too long, and that that axillary bud starts to grow out with like a new green shoot on it, right? So that's how we know we're not looking. I was going to say it's a big clue. It's not just a clue. It tells us definitively that it's not a root because roots don't have axillary buds. They don't grow that way. Okay. And then over here in this corner, this is a plant called Ruscus, Ruscus. Um, and it does this weird thing where it has these things that look like leaves and function like leaves are actually stem tissue. Okay. So what's going on here is in the evolutionary past of this plant, it was in an environment, its ancestor was in an environment where it lost its leaves. Maybe it was in a really dry place where leaves can be kind of a problem. They can be a liability. So it got rid of its leaves or didn't totally get rid of them. They just converted them into these little dry scaly structures. And you can kind of see it in this picture if you look up close, maybe not. And then later in its evolutionary story, the plant moved into a place where it's like, oh, actually, it is kind of nice having leaves. I would like to have leaves. And so it re-evolved leaves, but rather than remaking leaves out of the actual true leaves, it basically took these axillary buds sitting in the axils of these scale leaves and turned them into basically leaf structures. Okay. But it's not a leaf because it sits in the axil of the true leaf, right? Even though the true leaf is just now this little dry, scaly thing. It grows from an axillary bud. And see this little thing on here? This is actually the remnant of a flower. So they have flowers sitting on the middle of these leaf-like structures. You would never have a flower on a true leaf. Flowers are always born on stems. Okay, so that tells us that this is stem tissue here. Okay. These leaf-like stems are called cladodes. That's the term for them. Okay. So these are all just examples of kind of, up here in the left, more typical stems, and then variations, different things that stems can do, right? And how we know that they are actually stems, even though they don't look and or function like the way we usually think of stems. Roots, same thing, right? We've got sort of our main types of roots and then just different examples of different things that roots can do. So over here, kind of our two main types of roots. We talk about tap roots and fibrous roots. So taproot is basically what most things have. So most angiosperms that are not monocots, they're going to grow with this kind of a taproot. Think of a carrot, right? A carrot's a classic taproot. So it's just sort of more or less one main central branch of the root that then sends off side branches of smaller roots, grows down pretty deep, kind of one central thing here. That's a taproot versus a fibrous root. This is what we find in grasses and other monocots, stuff like, lilies, orchids. All these things are monocots. Monocots basically in their ancestral evolutionary history, they got rid of the taproot, switched over to a fibrous root. This is probably an adaptation to sort of swampy, wetter soils. And basically what makes a fibrous root is that the at the base of the stem where the roots emerge from the plant, you have a bunch of branches of the root that are all more or less the same diameter, the same kind of thickness. So rather than one central branch, they sort of all explode out sort of right at the top of the root where the root originates. Okay, pretty unique to monocots. Okay, that's a monocot featuristic. And we'll talk about monocots versus eudicots and stuff like that, but that should all kind of ring a bell from your Gen Bio 2 class. All right. Roots can engage in storage, so like a beet. This is a beet, right? And so compare with a potato, which is a storage stem. This is an underground storage root. And again, we know it's not a stem because it would never have like any kind of trace of a leaf on it, right? Unlike a potato that maybe has like a little leaf scar, or a ginger root that has leaf scars all over it. This never has leaves attached to it. It never has axillary buds anywhere on it. Okay. Just this swollen storage thing at the top, and then the rest of the sort of more absorptive roots down below. You've got things like prop roots emerging from palms do this a lot, especially where because palms they're trees, but they don't actually get thicker. They don't have secondary growth as they grow up. So as they get taller, they're more apt to tip over, and so they'll send out these roots from the trunk to kind of prop themselves up, literally. That's what a prop root is referring to. Okay. Um, other kinds of things. So this is over here. We've got buttress roots in really tall rainforest trees. Basically the same thing. Like the roots form these kind of very ridge structures, very kind of tall ridges that are biomechanically strong to also fortify the tree and keep it from tipping over. We've got things like strangler figs that start out growing up in the canopy of another tree. They start out life as what's called an epiphyte, which is a plant that grows on another plant, and they'll send roots down to the ground, making contact with the ground, and eventually they'll wrap these roots all around the host tree that they're growing in, and they'll choke it out. They'll strangle it. Okay. So these are called strangler figs, and they do this kind of a thing. So these aerial roots, meaning that they grow from above down to the ground and then make contact with the ground and do the usual root things. They kill their host tree, and then if enough time passes, the host tree can rot away, and you'll be left with this tree that's has like a totally hollow trunk in the middle, these strangler figs. Some things that grow in really wet, swampy areas, like a cypress, will send up these root extensions called pneumatophores, and these are basically like breathing tubes because the roots need to breathe, right? All the tissue under here needs oxygen for cellular respiration. So these pneumatophores are basically just like little poking up a little straw so they can get some air in to supply the roots with oxygen. Okay. Different rooting strategies. This diagram over here is just kind of showing how, some plants will send their roots down. Some plants, right, they'll have deep roots that penetrate down. Some plants will have more shallow roots, and this is especially prominent in desert environments. There's kind of these distinct strategies for getting water in deserts. So some plants like mesquite, palo verde, or like our creosote closer to home, or sagebrush does this. They send down roots pretty deep, and what they're trying to do is access water in sort of these deep water tables that's more sort of predictable, more consistent, right? Other things like cacti, so succulents tend to do this. They store water. Part of their ecological strategy is to store water in the body of the plant, either in the leaves or the stems. They tend to have shallow spreading roots because what they're trying to do is access water that falls in kind of brief, rainfall events and doesn't penetrate very far into the soil. But what they're trying to do is grab that water while they can, and then they suck it up into their body and store it in their body and kind of save it for later, saving it for a non-rainy day, so to speak. Okay, so different things roots can do ecologically. Roots typically emerge at the base of the stem, right? So, um, the over here, what we've got is a monocot, and this is kind of the main roots here, the sort of more typically growing roots, or over here, this plant, this eudicot, these are the sort of the regular roots. But a lot of plants will also then kind of grow roots from other places on the stem rather than just at the strictly at the base of the stem. So these are called adventitious roots. Adventitious just means literally the dictionary definition is formed accidentally or in an unusual anatomical position. So basically it just means roots growing in not the typical place, um, which would be the base of the stem. Okay. So some plants do this as just kind of part of their strategy, and it's totally a normal part of their development. So this is showing like this would be like a palm sending out prop roots, right? These are roots emerge higher up on the stem. Okay. But it's just totally part of the normal course of development. It's programmed into the plant in the way they grow, right? Or the strawberry here sending out these stolons, right? And so when the stolons reach a good spot, they'll send down little roots at the nodes and then send up leaves and then send out another stolon. So this adventitious root growth is just part of the normal deal. Or you could have adventitious roots in as a stress response, right? So some plants will only send out adventitious roots when they're kind of in a tough position, like maybe they're experiencing flooding, right? Over here. So like a plant that's sending out adventitious roots in response to flooding, or etiolation, which is plants stretching, looking for better light. So that kind of stretching growth means the stem isn't going to be as like sturdy. And so they'll send out little roots as kind of a prop there. Or in response to wounding, basically a lot of plants, you've probably seen this with houseplants, where if you take a cutting of a houseplant and you stick it in water, it'll start to send out roots. So that's wounding induced, right? Okay, so adventitious roots, that's kind of a thing. When we look at leaves, we can sort of define the overall structure of leaves. So in our area, the vast majority of plants have what's called a simple leaf, which basically just means that the entire leaf just has one undivided leaf blade. All right, so when we look at leaves, we've got the leaf blade, or what's called the lamina sometimes, Lamina. And then many leaves at the base, they'll have a little stalk that attaches the leaf to the stem. That's called the petiole. Okay, not every plant has a petiole. Sometimes the leaf blade attaches kind of directly to the stem. So simple leaf just has one undivided blade. Compound leaves just means that the leaf blade is divided up into a bunch of separate subunits, but it's still one single leaf. And there's two main forms for these compound leaves. We can define pinnately compound leaves, and so you can see a pinnately compound leaf. You've got this central, the petiole becomes this kind of central stalk called the rachis, rachis, and you've got these leaflets attached, and they kind of go up like a ladder. And they maybe are, you might have two leaflets attached right at the same point, or they might be slightly offset. But either way, this kind of ladder-like compound leaf is called pinnately compound. Or you can have your petiole and then all the leaflets attached kind of in one central point. That's called palmately compound. And I always remember, I think palmately is referring to like a palm because a lot of palms do this. Although a lot of palms also have pinnately compound leaves. I always remember palmately as just kind of like your palm, like your hand, your fingers all attach kind of to this central point, which is the palm. So that's kind of how I remember it. All right. So simple, compound, and within compound pinnately versus palmately. Here's just like an interesting example from this is a tree that grows on campus. So the honey mesquite, no, honey locust. I always call it the wrong thing. It's honey locust, yes. Gladicia triacanthos. This is a tree that's all over campus. They're the ones that have the bean pods, the really woody, kind of leathery bean pods that kind of spiral as they go down. You've probably seen it. Um, so they have palmately compound leaves, but they do this interesting thing where some of the leaves on the tree are what's called once pinnate. So you've just got one central branch with these leaflets coming off of it. But that some of the leaflets do this weird thing like part way where they branch again. So this is more of like what we call like a secondary or a bipinnate leaf. So once pinnate would be like more like this central stalk with these leaflets on it, but that some of these leaflets branch again. So this part is kind of like bipinnate or twice pinnate. This leaf over here, here's a leaf. The whole thing is just twice pinnate. So I didn't explain this very well, but basically what happens on these trees is like farther down on a branch, all the leaves are once pinnate. Toward the tips of the branch, the leaves convert to being twice pinnate like this. So here's the base of the leaf, right? And each leaflet is itself branched. And it kind of the transition zone where you're transitioning from once to twice pinnate, you get these weird leaves that are sort of like a mix of both. So yeah, something to notice. And since these trees are all over campus, maybe next time you're walking around, try to find one of these that's sort of in this in-between point. Just a weird little thing. Okay. So leaves, their main job is photosynthesis, and most of them have a pretty flattened form, right? I mean, they're basically solar panels. And so think about like the design of solar panels. Solar panels are flat with a big area oriented perpendicular to the rays of the sun. That's kind of the best way to design a solar panel, right? But leaves can do other stuff too. So we already mentioned the cacti, where the leaves have been converted into spines, and the job of photosynthesis has been handed over to the stems. All right. Usually the spines, we kind of consider them as like defense, protection against things trying to eat that stem tissue. And that is true, but it's also been demonstrated that these spines also function to radiate heat away from the central body of the plant. Okay, so it's not only protection, it's also like this physiological helping the plant to cool off. And some spines, if they're thick enough, can also help to reduce incoming sunlight to keep the plant from overheating. It depends on the plant, okay, the species. Um, Sometimes leaves can play a role in helping with pollination, right? So poinsettia is an example of this. In poinsettia, the flowers themselves are teeny tiny. So these little structures here, not very showy or attractive to pollinators. And for whatever reason in their evolutionary history, they went all in on these weird tiny flowers. And at some point they're like, oh, we actually need like a good way to attract pollinators, but we can't make petals that are big enough. So they did the next best thing. They basically recruited leaves that were just right underneath the flowers and pigmented them. All right. Leaves that have a support role with like flowering and anything to do with flowers or pollination, we call those bracts, Bracts, bracts. So that's what these are, these red leaves that help attract pollinators are a type of a bract. You can also have water storage in leaves. So cacti store water in the stems, but things like ice plants over here in the lower right, they are storing water in the leaves, and that's just a basically an alternate version of succulents, and which is a strategy generally for surviving in arid, dry environments, right? Not much water around, and so whenever there is water around, you draw as much of it up as you can into the body and store it somewhere in the body. Could be the leaf, could be the stem, doesn't really matter, right? It depends on the plant species. Over here in the middle, we've got Mother of Thousands, which this is a close-up of a leaf on the margins of the leaves. Basically, it's producing little clones. So this is another reproductive strategy. Um, Basically, just making little genetic copies of the plant on the margins. When they get big enough, they'll even send out roots. We actually have tons of these in the greenhouse. So if you want one to grow at home, just let me know and I will grab you some. Okay, they're pretty fun. Or over here, we've got like a vetch, something in the legume family, most likely here. And the leaf, basically, this is a compound leaf. Here's the rachis of the leaf, that central kind of stalk of the leaf. But rather than having leaflets that are specialized for photosynthesis, these leaflets are tendrils, which function for basically, because this is a vining plant, they help the plant to grab onto neighboring stems or whatever it might be, like a fence, whatever they're climbing up. Okay, so a tendril is for grabbing. Stems also can be converted into tendrils, incidentally. So, yep. So just some of the diversity of the different things that leaves and stems can do. Um, all right. One other thing that's super important, this is going to be a big one in identification of plants, is the pattern with which leaves attach to the stem. So the term for this is phyllotaxy. As we go through, and a lot of these vocabulary terms that we use in science, um, come from Greek or Latin roots. And so I'm pretty much always going to emphasize, if you've had me before, I emphasize root words a lot, Greek and Latin roots, because they're good tools they do two things. If you know the Greek and Latin roots, then if you see a word you've never seen before, but you can recognize the roots, it can help you at least guess what that word means. And they can also be memory aids. Okay, you can use them for like mnemonics or just to remember a term, right? If you can remember kind of what the term's supposed to be referring to and what the Greek or Latin roots are for that, for what those meanings are. Okay, so phyllotaxy, in this case, phyllo is Greek for leaf, and taxi is Greek for movement, actually, right? So maybe if you took micro, you might have learned about chemotaxis, which is the movement of bacteria in response to gradients of, certain chemicals. Okay. So in this case, the leaves aren't exactly moving, but it's just referring to the pattern that they make as you sort of follow the leaf attachment up a stem, right? That's what phyllotaxy means. So there's kind of two main ways is how I think about it. Two main types of phyllotaxy. There's alternate and there's opposite. Okay. So what alternate means is just at a node, there's only one leaf attached. Okay. If at a node there's only one leaf attached, that is alternate phyllotaxy versus opposite at a node there are two leaves attached and usually directly opposite from each other. So that's where opposite comes in. The third one is pretty rare. It's whorled, which just means that at a node there's three or more leaves attached. Not very common. Okay. So that is a thing. Some plants do that, but it's pretty rare. So it's pretty memorable when you do see a plant that has whorled phyllotaxy. Okay. And then within alternate, we can break this down. There's kind of two main subtypes of alternate leaf attachment. Alternate spiral is the most common, and what that means is just that the pattern of the leaves as you follow them around the stem. It's kind of hard to illustrate it in sort of a 2D illustration, but basically they're spiraling around. Okay, this is the most common leaf phyllotaxis, alternate spiral. Or you could have alternate disticus, and what that means is that they're alternate. There's only one leaf at each node, but each successive leaf is 180 degrees across the stem from the previous one. This is more common in like low light, like forest environments. So we don't see it too often here in the desert because we generally live in pretty high light environments. So alternate disticus, or sometimes that's called two ranked. Okay. Disticus literally means two ranked. Okay. But so alternate spiral, the main ones we're going to see are alternate spiral and then opposite. And then the decussate is just a fancy term that just means that each pair of opposite leaves is shifted 90 degrees relative to the other. And that's really the only pattern with opposite leaf attachment. So we could just, I'm going to say, don't even worry about the decussate part. Just remember opposite. So opposite and alternate spiral are our two principal leaf attachment patterns. Okay. And then there's a lot of descriptive terms to describe, the leaf, um, the way the leaves attach. So if there's a petiole, we could call that petiolate. If there's no petiole, we call that sessile, which just means attached directly. If there's like a sheath at the base of the petiole, right? All of these are terms. And then over here, we've got all these other terms. We've got all these terms to describe the shape of the leaf tip. We've got all these terms for leaf margins. I thought that was my next slide. It wasn't. Oh well. And the point here is you don't need to like worry about like kind of memorizing these. Um, it's kind of more the kind of thing. There are a lot of terms to describe morphology, the form of an organism. Um, so just know that they're there. I mean, that's what glossaries are for. Okay, I do a lot of identification. I still re rely heavily on glossaries. So it's not anything that you need to expect yourself to master in this class. It's more just a familiarity, like, okay, there's a lot of words. Sometimes you're gonna have to be looking up words. Okay, that's not such a bad thing. All right. One last thing that I want to say before I'm going to kind of end this one here is just talking about this idea of like homology and what the identity of these organs. So kind of going back to this idea that, you can have many different types of underground storage organs, like a potato is a type of a tuber, a beet is a type of a storage root. And then we've got things like onions or garlic that there's underground storage, but it's actually leaves, right? So we've got all three of our vegetative organs represented here in underground storage organs. So how do we know, right? Like we already kind of touched on this, but like, you know, you can't just assume because it's underground that it's a root is the main idea. So what is the homology of these organs? In other words, what are the organs kind of really, right? That's what homology means. It's like what's the actual identity of that organ? So despite similar function, similar appearance, a potato is a stem. And again, right, we can tell that by oftentimes positional information. So an onion is our underground storage leaves because we can identify the actual stem tissues at the base of this thing. There's roots coming out of it, and then multiple basically leaf-like structures coming out above. They're not green, they don't do photosynthesis, but they still have the overall form of a leaf, and they're still attached to the stem at nodes in the way we would expect for the overall shoot, right? Okay. Versus like, the potato, well, how do we know it's a stem? Well, it's got axillary buds. Maybe it'll have some like leaf scars right below the axillary bud where there's some kind of a rudimentary leaf attached there. Okay. So that's kind of basically what I'm trying to say, right? Same thing with like the cladode, like the ruscus, where how do we know that those are stem tissue and not leaves? Okay. So that's kind of a theme when we're talking about plant form. All right. Okay. Yeah, that next one, right? So Ruscus does that. Um, Asparagus is a relative of Ruscus that also has these sort of leaf-like stems. So here we can see it really well. So over here on the left, we got Arabidopsis, which is kind of has the typical shoot construction. So here's our stem. When we've got a determinate leaf attached to the stem, we had an axillary bud in the axil of the stem that grew out as its own branch. Okay. Over here, we've got an asparagus, and we've got this thing that looks and functions like a leaf. That's a cladode, right? That's the term for that. But look, we've got this kind of main stem, elongating, indeterminate stem. And then here's the actual leaf. So it's kind of Ruscus does the same thing. It's kind of a little scale leaf. But in the axil of the leaf, we have an axillary bud that grows out as a branch, as a stem. It's just that in this case, this stem branch, rather than kind of growing on as a sort of typical indeterminate stem, it grows kind of as a leaf. But the homology, like the positioning of things, the true leaf attached directly to the stem with the axillary bud sitting in it in its axil, that kind of tells this story that like that's how we know this isn't actually a leaf, right? Okay. Yes, that is a good stopping point. So I'm going to stop there and get this thing posted. And then we will continue on with the rest of the morphology lecture for next time. Okay.